The boy lived in a world of faded colors and constant noise. His small apartment, tucked away on the third floor of a tired brick building, always smelled like whatever the neighbors were cooking and the faint, sweet scent of rain that seeped through the old window frames. His world was the rumble of the city bus on the street below, the shouts of kids playing in the alley, and the tired sigh of his mother when she came home from her second job. But in his corner of the living room, behind a curtain strung up for a little privacy, was another world entirely. It was a world of pure sound, a world he controlled. This world was built on 88 keys, black and white. Of a slightly beat-up electric keyboard his parents had bought him from a pawn shop 2 birthdays ago. It was the best they could do, and to him, it was everything. His name was Alex. Music was the language he spoke better than his own. He wasn't a talkative kid. At school, he was the one who sat in the back, his head often bent over a notebook, not taking notes, but drawing little staffs and scribbling melodies that popped into his head. He didn't have friends in the way other kids did. His friends were the long-dead composers whose dusty books he borrowed from the library, and the YouTube pianists who played in grainy videos he'd watch on the family's old, slow computer. He taught himself. He'd spend hours with his headphones on, his fingers tracing the patterns on the keyboard, first slowly, then faster and faster, until the complex runs of a Bach fugue or the thundering chords of a Beethoven sonata flowed from him as naturally as breathing. The keyboard was his escape, a place where the peeling paint on the walls and the worn-out sneakers on his feet didn't matter. All that mattered was the next note, the next phrase, the next story he could tell without saying a single word. He had a dream so big and bright it felt foolish to even say it out loud. He wanted to learn from Madame Dubois. She wasn't just a teacher. She was an institution in the city. Her name was whispered in music circles with a mix of reverence and fear. She was a legend, a pianist who had played in concert halls all over the world before settling down to teach. It was said she only took the most gifted students, the ones with perfect pedigrees, and a future already paved in gold. Her studio was in the wealthy part of town, a place Alex had only seen through the bus window. To him, getting a lesson with Madame Dubois was like getting a ticket to another planet. One evening, his mother sat him down at their small kitchen table. She looked exhausted, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual, but she had a strange, hopeful look on her face. She pushed a thick envelope across the table. Inside was a stack of bills, small and large, held together with a rubber band. "Your father and I," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We've been saving. It's not much, but it's enough for one introductory lesson. Just one, to see if, well, to just see." Alex's throat went tight. He knew what this meant. It meant extra shifts, skipped lunches, and delayed repairs on their car. It was a sacrifice made of love and hope, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders. He looked from the money to his mother's tired, smiling face, and he knew he couldn't let them down. He had to make this count. The day of the lesson, Alex felt like he was going to be sick. He put on his one good shirt, a plain white button-up that was a little stiff and a little too tight in the shoulders. His best pants were faded but clean. As he boarded the bus that would take him across town, he felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The neighborhoods outside the windows slowly changed. The run-down stores and graffiti-covered walls gave way to manicured lawns, big houses with perfect gardens, and streets that were quiet and clean. It was like entering a different country. With every stop, his confidence shrank a little more. He felt like an imposter, a kid from the dusty part of town who was about to step into a world of polished marble and crystal. He found the studio in a beautiful old building with gleaming brass doors. The name on the directory was simply Dubois. He took a deep breath, his palms sweating on the cool metal of the doorknob, and went inside. The silence was the first thing that hit him. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a heavy, respectful silence, the kind you find in a library or a church. The air smelled of lemonwood polish and something else, something floral and expensive. The floor was dark, shiny wood, and on the walls were framed photographs of Madame Dubois with famous people. Her posture always perfect, her smile a controlled, elegant thing. In the center of the room, like a king on its throne, sat a gleaming black grand piano. It was so beautiful it hurt to look at. His keyboard at home suddenly seemed like a child's toy. A door opened, and a woman emerged. She was tall and thin, dressed in a tailored black suit. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant bun, and she wore glasses that perched on the end of her nose. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned him from head to toe. They lingered for a second on his scuffed shoes before meeting his gaze. "You must be Alex," she said. Her voice was exactly as he'd imagined it, crisp with no warmth. "You are early." It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. She led him to the piano bench. It was smooth and cold. "Show me what you can do," she said, not sitting down herself, but standing over him like a judge. "Play a C major scale, please." Alex's mind went blank. A C major scale? It was the first thing he had ever learned. He could play it in his sleep. But here, under her piercing gaze, with the weight of his parents' sacrifice pressing down on him, his fingers felt like clumsy sausages. He placed them on the keys, which were cool and smooth, nothing like the slightly worn plastic of his own keyboard. He took a breath and started. His thumb hit the first C, but his index finger fumbled on the D, landing with a dull thud next to the key instead of on it. He stopped, his face flushing with heat. "Sorry," he mumbled. He tried again, this time a little faster, trying to get it over with. But his nervousness made his fingers stiff, and the transition was clumsy, not the smooth, flowing motion he knew he was capable of. The notes came out, but they were lifeless, uneven. Madame Dubois let out a long, slow sigh. It was a sound filled with disappointment, and it cut Alex deeper than any sharp word could have. She walked over to a bookshelf and pulled out a thin, brightly colored book with cartoon notes on the cover. She placed it on the piano stand. The title read, "My First Piano Lessons." "I see," she said, her voice flat. "Well, we have a great deal of work to do. It is clear you have had no proper training. We will start from the very beginning. Do not get your hopes up, young man. Talent of a high level is a rare gift. Not everyone is cut out for this." She said it not with cruelty, but with a kind of finality, as if she were a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. She was stating a fact as she saw it. She had looked at him, listened to him for 10 seconds, and had already put him in a box labeled untalented. Alex just stared at the cartoon book. He felt a hot prickle behind his eyes. He wanted to scream, "That's not me. I can play Liszt. I can play Chopin." But the words were stuck in his throat. All he could do was nod, a small, defeated movement. The lesson continued with him plunking out the simple, childish melodies from the book, each note feeling like a small betrayal of the complex music that lived inside him. When the hour was up, she dismissed him with a simple, "Same time next week. Practice these pages." Walking out of the studio and back into the sunlight felt like waking from a bad dream. The bus ride home was a blur. The shame was a heavy sour taste in his mouth. He had failed. He had wasted his parents' money. He had let the music down. But as he got closer to home, something else started to bubble up inside him, pushing aside the shame. It was a small, hot spark of anger. It wasn't a wild, destructive anger, but a quiet, determined one. Her words echoed in his head. Not everyone is cut out for this. She had looked at his clothes, his fumbling nervousness, and had decided who he was. She had underestimated him. She had made a very big mistake. By the time he walked through his own front door, the shame was still there. But that little spark of anger had grown into a quiet, steady flame. He looked at the corner of the room where his keyboard waited. He wasn't going to quit. He was going to go back next week, and he was going to play her silly little songs. But in the quiet hours when no one was watching, he was going to practice. And he was going to get so good, so incredibly good, that one day she would have no choice but to see him for who he really was. The walk back to his apartment felt longer than the bus ride to the fancy part of town. Each step was heavy with the weight of Madame Dubois's judgment. The cartoonish book she had given him felt like a brick in his backpack. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to see the hopeful look on his mother's face and have to tell her that the famous teacher thought he was nothing special. He had to start with books meant for little kids. He sat on a bench in a small park near his building, watching some younger kids chase pigeons, and just let the feeling of failure wash over him. It was a cold, heavy blanket. He had been so sure, so full of a secret fire, and in 10 minutes she had poured a bucket of ice water on it. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass, something shifted inside him. The coldness started to recede, replaced by a slow, burning warmth. He thought about her eyes, the way they had looked right through him, seeing only his cheap shoes and his nervous hands. She hadn't heard the music he had in his head. She hadn't seen the countless hours he had spent teaching himself, the joy he felt when a difficult passage finally clicked into place. She had just made a guess, and she had guessed wrong. A quiet, stubborn resolve settled in his chest. He wouldn't quit. He would play her game. He would learn her simple songs and be her adequate student. But that wasn't all he would be. His second lesson was a week later. Alex walked into the pristine studio, his head held a little higher than before. He had spent the week practicing the silly little tunes from the My First Piano Lessons book. He had played them until his fingers knew them automatically, which left his mind free to wander. He sat at the grand piano, and this time, when Madame Dubois told him to play, he did. He played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, with perfect, even rhythm. He played Ode to Joy with all the correct notes. It was boring, lifeless music, but he played it flawlessly. When he finished, he looked up at her. She was standing by the window, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Much better," she said, her voice still crisp, but maybe a tiny bit less cold. "Your rhythm is adequate. Your note precision is adequate. You see, with proper, simple guidance, even a beginner can show improvement." The word adequate was her highest form of praise, and it was meant to keep him in his place. To her, it was a pat on the head. To Alex, it was a victory he had hidden. The universe of music inside him, behind a wall of adequate performance. He had worn the mask perfectly. He nodded, said a quiet thank you, and went home to practice his simple songs, his mask firmly in place. The real problem was where to practice his real music. His little electric keyboard was fine, but the sound was thin and artificial. He needed the feel of real strings and hammers, the resonance of real wood. He started spending his afternoons just walking around his neighborhood, exploring places he'd never been before. He was looking for a piano, a real one, that he could use. One afternoon he wandered a little farther than usual and found himself in front of the local community center. It was an old brick building, not fancy like Madame Dubois's place, but solid and welcoming. On a whim, he pushed the heavy front door open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax and old paper. He could hear the thump, thump, thump of a basketball in a gym down the hall and the muffled sounds of a class. He walked down a quiet corridor, past rooms with signs for senior bingo and youth art club. At the very end of the hall, there was a door that was slightly ajar. He peeked inside. It was a small, forgotten-looking meeting room. And in the corner, covered in a fine layer of dust, sat an old upright piano. It was nothing like the gleaming grand at the studio. The wood was scuffed and faded, and some of the black keys were chipped. But to Alex, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He cautiously entered the room. The only light came from a single high window, casting a dusty, golden beam onto the piano lid. He lifted the lid, and the smell of old wood and felt filled the air. He sat down on the worn bench. His fingers trembled slightly as he touched the keys. He pressed a middle C. The sound that came out was not perfect. It was a little tinny, a little out of tune, but it was real. The note vibrated through the wood, through the bench, and up into his bones. He felt like he had come home. He looked around, making sure he was alone, and then he began to play. He didn't start with the simple songs from Madame Dubois. Started with a Bach fugue he had been learning from a library book. His fingers, which had felt clumsy and stiff under her gaze, now flew across the keys. The complex, interwoven melodies filled the small room, bouncing off the walls. The piano's imperfections gave the music a unique character, a warm, slightly melancholic voice. He played for an hour, losing all track of time. He played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, letting the haunting, sad melody fill the dusty room. This was his sanctuary, This was his real music school. He started going to the community center every day after school. He would do his homework at a small table in the corner, and then he would play for hours. The old piano became his closest friend. He learned its quirks, which keys stuck a little and which ones had a sweeter tone than the others. It was during these long, private sessions that he truly began to experiment. He would be playing a classical piece, a strict and structured melody, and a bluesy note would sneak in. At first he would stop, thinking he'd made a mistake, but then he started to like it. He started to do it on purpose. He would take a beautiful, flowing chop and waltz and suddenly drop in a heavy, syncopated rhythm from a jazz song he'd heard online. He would weave the raw, crying sound of the blues into the powerful, structured chords of a Beethoven sonata. He wasn't just copying music anymore. He was having a conversation with it. He was taking the old dead masters and mixing them with the living, breathing music of the streets he grew up on. It was a fusion of worlds, just like he was living a fusion of two lives. In the pristine world of Madame Dubois, he was the adequate beginner, playing simple tunes and accepting her faint praise. But in this dusty, forgotten room, he was a composer, an innovator, a virtuoso. He was creating something new, something that was entirely his own. The music he made here was full of life, full of his struggles, his anger, his hope, and his joy. It was messy and complicated and beautiful. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that this was the music he was born to make. And he also knew that one day the whole world, including Madame Dubois, was going to hear it. The days settled into a comfortable, if strange, rhythm. For an hour each week, Alex would enter the quiet, polished world of Madame Dubois. He would sit at the grand piano and play the simple songs from the beginner's book, his fingers moving with a careful, deliberate precision that earned him her faint adequate. He would nod, accept her critique on his hand position or his posture, and then leave the mask of the humble beginner perfectly in place. But the moment he was out the door, a different energy would take over. He would practically run to the bus stop, his heart beating not with nervousness, but with anticipation. He was heading home to his real lesson, his real teacher, and his real music. The community center had become his sanctuary. The old, dusty, upright piano was his closest confidant. He had started to leave a small, folded piece of cloth on the keys to keep the worst of the dust off. And the janitor, a kind old man who always smelled of coffee and mints, had started leaving the door to the little meeting room unlocked for him. It was their secret. In that room, Alex was free. He was no longer the kid from the wrong side of the tracks or the adequate beginner. He was a musician. His fingers would fly across the yellowed keys, pulling out the thundering drama of a Rachmaninoff concerto or the intricate, delicate beauty of a Mozart sonata. He was no longer just learning the notes. He was living inside them. He was breathing with the phrases, feeling the tension and release in every chord. The music he made there was alive, full of the grit of his neighborhood and the polish of the composers he admired. One Tuesday afternoon, he was packing up his backpack after a particularly intense practice session when he saw it. Tacked to a large cork bulletin board near the main entrance was a bright yellow flyer. The words were printed in big, bold letters: the 34th Annual Young Virtuosos Competition. His heart gave a little leap. He had heard of this competition. It was a big deal, the kind of event that got written about in the newspaper and covered on the local news. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the text. It was open to all musicians under the age of 18 in the city. There would be piano, violin, and cello categories. And then his eyes landed on the prize. It wasn't just a trophy or a small amount of cash. The first prize winner would receive a full, 4-year scholarship to the renowned Crestwood Conservatory of Music. Alex just stood there, staring at the flyer. A full scholarship. It was like a dream. The Crestwood Conservatory was one of the best in the country, a place where the truly gifted went to become professionals. It was a world away from his cramped apartment and his community center piano. It was a ticket out, a chance to not just learn music, but to live it, to surround himself with people who understood it the way he did. He wouldn't have to worry about being a burden on his parents. He could actually build a future. The thought was so big, so bright, it almost scared him. For a wild, glorious moment, He imagined himself walking onto that stage, his fingers flying across the keys, the judges' faces filled with shock and awe. He imagined winning, holding that certificate, and seeing the look on his parents' faces. But then reality came crashing back down. Who was he kidding? He would be competing against the best young musicians in the city. He would be competing against Madame Dubois's students, the ones she had been training for years, the ones who came from wealthy families, who had had the best teachers and the best instruments since they were 5 years old. He was just a kid who taught himself on a beat-up keyboard. The confidence he had built up in his secret sanctuary began to crumble. He turned away from the flyer, feeling a familiar cold knot of doubt in his stomach. It was a foolish dream. All week the flyer haunted him. He saw it in his mind when he was trying to do his homework. He saw it when he was lying in bed at night. The words full scholarship seemed to be burned into the back of his eyelids. He went to his lesson with Madame Dubois, and he played his simple song. But his heart wasn't in it. He was distracted. He kept thinking about the competition, about the chance, however small. He had to at least ask. He had to know. After his lesson, as he was packing up his sheet music, he took a deep breath. "Madame Dubois," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She was polishing the gleaming lid of her grand piano with a soft cloth. She didn't look up. "Yes, Alex." "I saw a flyer," he began, his hands starting to sweat. "For the young virtuoso's competition, I was thinking about maybe entering." She stopped polishing and slowly looked up at him. A small, sharp smile played on her lips, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile someone gives a child who has just said something adorable and ridiculous. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "The competition? Alex, be realistic." His face grew hot, but he pushed on. "The first prize is a scholarship to Crestwood." "Ah, yes," she said, putting her cloth down and folding her arms. "And that prize is for prodigies. For my students who have dedicated their lives to their craft, who have the pedigree and the training required for such an event. It is not for a hobbyist. Practice a lot," he said, a little more firmly than he intended. "You practice the scales I assign you," she corrected him, her voice turning cold. "You can adequately play a piece from a children's book. The competition requires a mastery of the instrument, a deep understanding of musical theory and history. You would be on that stage for 5 minutes before you were humiliated. You would be an embarrassment to yourself, and worse, you would be an embarrassment to this studio." She let that sink in for a moment. "I forbid it." The 2 words hit him like a physical blow. "I forbid it." She wasn't just giving him advice. She was trying to control him, to put him back in the little box she had created for him. The shame he had felt earlier came rushing back, but this time it was followed by a huge, roaring wave of anger. Who was she to tell him what he could and couldn't do? She had heard him play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and had decided his entire future. She had no idea. No idea at all. He didn't say another word. He just nodded, his jaw tight, and walked out of the studio. He didn't look back. The bus ride home was a blur of fury. Her words echoed in his head. "Embarrassment. I forbid it." Each word was a log on the fire that was now burning inside him. By the time he got to the community center, he was no longer just angry. He was determined. He was going to enter. He was going to show her. He sat down at the old upright piano, the familiar feel of the keys calming him slightly. He needed a weapon. He needed a piece of music that was so difficult, so impressive, that it would wipe the smug look off her face forever. He thought of the pieces he had been practicing, the ones that made his fingers ache and his mind race. And then he knew. Franz Liszt's La Campanella. It was famous for being one of the most technically challenging pieces ever written for the piano. With its fast, delicate, and repeated notes that sounded like a little bell, it was a piece that only a true virtuoso would even attempt. It was perfect. The next day, he went back to the community center and found the registration form for the competition hidden behind a stack of other papers on the bulletin. He took it, filled it out in his neat, careful handwriting, and mailed it on his way home. It was done. There was no turning back now. For the next few weeks, his life became a blur of secret, intense practice. He would go to his lessons with Madame Dubois and play his simple songs, his adequate performance a perfect disguise. But every other waking moment was spent with La Campanella. His fingers would stumble, the tempo would get away from him, and the frustration would sometimes bring him to the point of tears. But he would always take a deep breath, close his eyes, and start again. He was no longer just playing the notes. He was waging a war. And this old, dusty piano in a forgotten room was his battlefield. The night of the competition felt different from any other night Alex had ever known. The air in the grand concert hall was thick with a special kind of energy, a mix of nervous excitement and high expectation. The hall itself was a world away from the dusty community center room. It was huge, with 2 levels of velvet seats that curved around the stage, and massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen constellations. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old wood. Alex stood in the wings, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He peeked through the heavy red curtain at the sea of people. It was a full house. He saw critics with notepads, important-looking people in fancy clothes, proud parents all whispering to each other. And then he saw her. Madame Dubois was sitting in the very front row, her posture as straight and perfect as ever. She was dressed in an elegant dark green gown, and a small, satisfied smile was on her face. She was there to see her star pupil, a young man named Victor, perform. Alex had seen Victor play at a studio recital once. He was technically brilliant, with fingers that moved like lightning. But his music always sounded a little cold, a little empty. Tonight, Madame Dubois looked like a queen watching her prince. She had no doubt he would win. When her eyes scanned the stage, they passed right over Alex, who was hidden in the shadows. He was just part of the background to her, a stagehand, an insignificant detail. She had no idea he was even competing. He had made sure of that. The competition began. A young girl with a violin went first. She played a complicated piece by Paganini, and every note was perfect. Her fingers were a blur, her bow moved with incredible speed. It was impressive, but it felt like watching a machine. There was no heart in it. The audience applauded politely. Next came a cellist who played with great power and passion. But his face was a mask of intense concentration, and he never once looked up from his instrument. He was fighting the music, not dancing with it. The applause was a little louder this time. Then it was Victor's turn. He walked onto the stage with a confident swagger, sat at the gleaming concert grand piano, and launched into a difficult piece by Chopin. It was flawless. Every note was in its place. Every dynamic was perfectly executed. It was the kind of performance that made other musicians feel inadequate. The audience erupted in applause, and Madame Dubois beamed, giving a small, prim nod of approval. Alex felt a cold knot form in his stomach. How could he compete with that? Then, a voice over the speaker system called his name. And now, performing Franz Liszt's La Campanella. Please welcome Alex Chen. A few people in the audience looked around, whispering. They didn't recognize the name. Alex walked out onto the stage. The lights were blindingly bright. He could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him. He was wearing his one good suit, the one his mother had bought for a cousin's wedding. It was a little too big in the shoulders and a little too short in the arms. And he felt like a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. A few titters of laughter came from the back of the hall. He saw Madame Dubois's head whip around, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. Her mouth formed a small, perfect O of horror. He was an embarrassment to her, just as she had predicted. Alex ignored it all. He walked to the center of the stage, to the beautiful black grand piano, and sat down on the bench. It was smooth and cold. He took a deep breath, just like he had done 1,000 times in the quiet room at the community center. He closed his eyes for a second, blocking out the lights and the faces. He imagined he was back in that small, dusty room with just the old piano and his own thoughts. The noise of the hall faded away until there was only silence. He placed his fingers on the keys and then he began. The first notes that rang out were staggering. They were fast, impossibly fast, and crystal clear. The famous little bell theme of La Campanella danced out of the piano, light and delicate, yet full of power. A gasp went through the audience. People who had been whispering were now silent, leaning forward in their seats. The judges, who had been looking a bit bored, suddenly sat up straight, their eyes fixed on the stage. This was not the nervous beginner they had expected. This was a master. Alex's fingers flew across the keys, navigating the pieces, insane technical challenges with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. He played the lightning-fast runs, the huge jumps, the delicate trills, all without a single mistake. He was playing with a fire and a precision that was breathtaking. But then something truly extraordinary happened. About halfway through the piece, as the main melody returned, Alex did something that wasn't in the sheet music. He bent a note just slightly, giving it a soulful, bluesy feel that hung in the air like an ache. It was a small thing, but it changed everything. Then he did it again. And then he started to weave in a new rhythm underneath the classical melody. A subtle, syncopated swing that made the famous bell theme start to groove. He was seamlessly blending Liszt's 19th century classical masterpiece with the raw, heartfelt emotion of the blues and the complex, exciting rhythms of jazz. He was taking two different worlds of music and smashing them together to create something entirely new. The music was no longer just a display of technical skill. It was a story. It was the story of his life. The strict, disciplined classical lines were the world of Madame Dubois, the world he was supposed to live in. But the bluesy notes and the swinging rhythms were his world. The world of the community center of his neighborhood, of his own heart. The two were fighting, and then they were dancing. And then they were merging into one beautiful, complicated, and deeply emotional sound. The audience was completely captivated. They weren't just hearing a piano piece anymore. They were feeling an experience. They were hearing struggle and joy and anger and hope, all pouring out of one boy and one piano. He played with his eyes closed, his body swaying with the music, completely lost in the world he was creating. He reached the final, cascading series of notes that lead to the last powerful chord. He played it with all his strength, and the sound filled the enormous hall, vibrating through the floor and the seats. And then he lifted his hands from the keys. There was a moment of absolute, stunned silence. It was a heavy, profound silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. No one moved. No one breathed. They were all trying to process what they had just witnessed. The camera of the mind zoomed in on Madame Dubois. Her face was a picture of pure, unadulterated shock. Her mouth was wide open, her eyes were huge, and her hands were frozen halfway to her face in a gesture of disbelief. The condescension, the pride, the certainty was all gone, wiped away and replaced by sheer, uncomprehending awe. And then the silence broke. A single person in the back row started to clap, slowly at first, then faster. Then another person joined in, and another. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a thunderous, deafening roar. People were on their feet, shouting bravo, and encore. The judges were standing, clapping with huge smiles on their faces. Alex sat at the piano, a little dazed, looking out at the sea of people standing for him. He had not just played a piece of music. He had bared his soul. And in that moment, he knew with a certainty that filled every part of him that he had won. The roar of the crowd was a physical thing, a wall of sound that hit Alex like a wave. He sat at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys, his mind a complete blank. The lights were so bright, and the faces in the crowd were just a blur of shapes and colors. He had done it. The music that had been living inside him for so long, the secret symphony he had practiced in a dusty room, was now out in the world, and the world was cheering for it. A man in a tuxedo came onto the stage and gently touched his shoulder, guiding him to stand up. The applause got even louder then, a deafening, wonderful thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. Alex gave a shaky bow, his legs feeling like they might give out underneath him. He didn't know what to do with his hands, so he just held them together in front of him, his knuckles white. Backstage, the chaos was just as intense, but it was a different kind. People were patting him on the back, shaking his hand, and saying things he couldn't quite process through the ringing in his ears. Incredible. Genius. I've never heard anything like it. He just nodded, a dazed smile on his face, letting himself be guided toward a small area where the other contestants were waiting. Victor, Madame Dubois's star pupil, was standing by himself, his face pale. He wouldn't look at Alex. The other musicians, who had barely acknowledged him before, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and envy. He was no longer the kid in the ill-fitting suit. He was the one they were all talking about, an official-looking woman with a clipboard. Came in and asked them all to line up on the side of the stage. It was time for the awards ceremony. Alex's heart started beating fast again. The performance was over, but this was the moment of truth. He stood there, listening to the presenter on stage talk about the high quality of this year's competition. He talked about the technical skill, the musicality, the dedication of all the young performers. Then he opened the envelope for the third-place prize. And the third-place winner, receiving a cash prize of $500, is a wonderful cellist, Melissa Vogel. The audience applauded politely as a girl near Alex let out a happy squeak and ran onto the stage. Alex's palms started to sweat. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. He had already won. He had shown them what he could do. He had shown her. But still, a part of him, the part that had sacrificed so much, desperately wanted to hear his name called. And in second place, the presenter continued, the runner-up receiving a cash prize of $1,000. The brilliant violinist, David Kim. It's more applause. David, a serious-looking boy with glasses, walked calmly onto the stage and shook the presenter's hand. There was only one prize left, the big one. The presenter paused, building the tension in the hall. This year's first-place winner, he said, his voice echoing through the silent room, blew our judges away. Not only with his breathtaking technical mastery of one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire, but with his profound artistry and innovative spirit. He has shown us that music is not just about playing the notes on the page, but about telling a story that comes from the soul. The judges' decision was unanimous. The winner of the 34th Annual Young Virtuosos Competition, and the recipient of a full 4-year scholarship to the Crestwood Conservatory of Music, is Alex Chen. For a second, Alex didn't move. It was as if he had heard someone else's name. But then the man in the tuxedo was gently pushing him forward, and the audience was on its feet again, the applause even louder than before. He walked onto the stage in a dream, his feet barely touching the ground. The presenter handed him a heavy, engraved plaque and a thick folder with the Crestwood Conservatory logo on it. He held it in his hands, the weight of it feeling more real than anything he had ever felt. This was it. This was his future. He looked out into the crowd and he saw his parents standing in the aisle near the back, his mother crying into her hands and his father beaming, his face shining with pride. That was the moment it all became real. After the ceremony, Alex was swarmed by people wanting to congratulate him, but he was looking for one person. He finally saw her standing near the edge of the crowd, away from everyone else. Madame Dubois. She wasn't clapping. She was just standing there, perfectly still. He excused himself from a conversation and walked toward her, his heart pounding for a different reason now. This was the final confrontation. As he got closer, he saw that her perfect posture was gone. Her shoulders were slumped slightly, and there was a look on her face he had never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was a look of profound humility, of complete and utter awe. He stopped in front of her, not sure what to say. He just held his plaque and his scholarship folder. She looked at him, her eyes glistening. The condescension, the coldness, the superiority, it was all gone. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if the words were too difficult to say. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was soft, almost a whisper. All these years, she began, her voice a little shaky, I have been teaching students to play the notes. I have taught them technique, precision, discipline. I thought that was everything. I heard notes for years, Alex, but tonight, you didn't just play notes. You made them speak. You made them cry and sing and shout. You taught me what music is. She took a deep breath, and a single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. I am so sorry, she said, looking him directly in the eye. "I was so wrong. I am so sorry I underestimated you." It wasn't a long speech, but it was more powerful than any apology Alex could have imagined. It wasn't just about her being wrong about him. It was about her entire understanding of her art being changed. In that moment, he didn't feel angry anymore. He just felt a sense of peace. He simply nodded, a small, genuine smile on his face. "Thank you," he said. The ride home in his father's old car was the happiest ride of his life. His mother couldn't stop touching the scholarship folder, as if to make sure it was real. His father kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, a huge, proud grin on his face. When they got back to their small apartment, they didn't even turn on the lights. They just sat in the dark, looking at the plaque on the kitchen table, which was suddenly the most important object in the world. His mother reached over and took his hand. "We always knew," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you had something special in you." The next day, Alex went back to the community center. The old, dusty, upright piano was waiting for him in the corner of the room. He sat down on the worn bench, the same bench where he had spent countless hours dreaming of this moment. He didn't play La Campanella. He didn't play a complicated classical piece. He just played a simple melody, one of the first songs he had ever taught himself, a little tune he had made up. He played it softly, letting the notes fill the quiet room. He had won the competition, the scholarship, and the respect of the woman who had dismissed him. But sitting there, at his old, forgotten piano, he knew that the real victory wasn't the prize. It was the music itself. It was the journey. And he knew, with a joy that bubbled up from deep inside, that this was only the beginning.